The dinner table is set the way it always is on Sundays, white plates. A candle she lit before he arrived. Wine already poured, sitting at exactly his spot. The chair facing the window, the chair he has sat in for 11 years. Through every season this relationship has had. He notices none of that. He comes in from the garage still half thinking about a call he'd taken that afternoon. A contractor, an argument about materials, money he feels wasn't respected. He sets his keys on the counter with a sound that's a little too definitive, sits down, picks up his fork. She's across from him. He looks at his plate first, then at her. The automatic scan men do. Is everything okay? Not because he's worried, because he wants to confirm that everything is fine, so he can eat without having to navigate anything complicated. She meets his eyes for exactly 1 second, then she looks down at her food. No smile, no greeting, no opening move. He waits. Nothing comes. He fills the silence himself. Something about the contractor, the estimate, the way people don't take pride in work anymore. His voice is confident, natural. He's telling a story he's comfortable with. She cuts her chicken into small pieces, methodically, quietly. He glances at her between sentences. She nods once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement that he's still speaking. Her eyes stay on her plate. Her shoulders are slightly turned, not toward him, not fully away, just angled. The room doesn't feel hostile. It feels muted. He finishes the story, forks a piece of potato. The silence stretches 3 seconds, then 5. He reaches for his wine. Somewhere in the back of his chest, something tightens. Not fear, not quite. Something he doesn't name because he was never taught a word for it. He makes a joke, a decent one, the kind that usually gets a small laugh from her. Not big, but genuine. She smiles, faint, polite. The smile of someone who is still in the room but has moved somewhere else inside themselves. He watches that smile and knows, without understanding how he knows, that something has shifted. Not broken, not even necessarily damaged, but shifted, the way a door settles in its frame after a hard winter and no longer quite fits the way it once did. He doesn't ask. He pours more wine and talks about the weather coming this week. Most men will call that dinner unremarkable. But there is something happening in that silence, something precise, something intentional, that most men in their 60s spend years completely failing to read. Silence in the context of a woman who was once expressive with you is never random. It is never passive. It is a form of internal consolidation. And once you understand its architecture, the entire dynamic of male-female communication after a certain age begins to look entirely different. Here is what's happening psychologically beneath that quiet. She has reached a conclusion, not a verdict, not a decision, but a conclusion about effort, about reciprocity, about whether the emotional investment she has made in this relationship is producing something sustainable. She is not withdrawing to punish. She is withdrawing to protect. There is a distinction between those two that most men never pause long enough to recognize. By 60, most women have developed a sophisticated internal accounting system. Not one built on scorekeeping. That's too simple, too transactional. It's built on pattern recognition. She has watched this man across many hundreds of ordinary moments. She knows what he pays attention to and what he lets slide. She knows which conversations he leans into and which ones he tolerates before redirecting toward himself. She has watched what energizes him and what quietly exhausts her. And when she goes quiet, it usually means one thing. The arithmetic has begun to feel uneven in a way she no longer has the energy to correct alone. Now, here is where most analyses of this moment go wrong. They frame it as a problem of communication. They say she needs to express herself more directly. He needs to listen better. The solution, they imply, is more talking, better talking. But that completely misses the deeper layer. The silence is not a breakdown in communication. It is communication. It is the most precise signal she can send. More precise than words, actually, because words can be argued with. Words can be deflected, reframed, minimized. Silence cannot be argued with. It simply sits there, accurate and immovable. What she is communicating is not anger. Anger is loud. What she is communicating is something quieter and far more significant. I am no longer certain you are worth the full weight of my presence. That is a sentence worth sitting with, Because for men who built their identity around being providers, decision makers, men who handle things, the idea that someone they care for has begun to ration their attention is not just uncomfortable, it is quietly destabilizing. It challenges something they rarely put into words: the assumption that presence alone is enough, that showing up, paying the bills, staying loyal, that these things speak for themselves. They don't. Not anymore. Not after 60. By this age, a woman has already outlasted the version of love that runs on obligation. She has done the maintenance years. She has stayed through the hard seasons. What she is looking for now, what she has perhaps always been looking for, but only now has the clarity to name, is conscious companionship. The sense that she is not just alongside you, but seen by you. And when that seeing stops, even gradually, even without malice, she doesn't argue. She doesn't issue an ultimatum. She gets quiet. The tightening in his chest at that dinner table, that wasn't an irrational reaction. That was a man's instincts working correctly, registering a signal his conscious mind hadn't yet processed. The question is what he does next. Before going further, something needs to be said that most scripts like this will never say. Not every silence means the same thing. A woman who has gone quiet because she is processing grief, managing her own health, navigating something private and unrelated to you. That silence deserves space, not interpretation. Assuming every quiet moment is a signal about the relationship is its own form of self-centeredness. It makes you the center of her inner life, even when you may not be the subject of it. Emotional intelligence at this age requires the ability to distinguish between a silence that is about you and a silence that is simply human. The difference is usually legible if you're paying attention. There's warmth in someone who is privately preoccupied but still fundamentally present. There's a subtle withdrawal in someone who has begun to reconsider you. One is a person absorbed in their own life. The other is a person slowly disinvesting from yours. Conflating the two is a failure of observation, not a failure of compassion. There's a second caveat worth naming. Some women, particularly those shaped by difficult earlier relationships, use silence as leverage. Not as honest communication, but as a form of low-grade emotional control, a way of generating anxiety, of keeping you off balance and responsive. This is not common, but it happens. And a man who has spent 60-plus years developing judgment should trust himself enough to recognize the difference between a signal sent in honesty and one deployed for effect. Genuine withdrawal has a quality of sadness to it. It costs her something to be quiet. There's no satisfaction in it. Strategic silence has a different texture. It watches, it waits for a reaction. There is underneath it a certain alertness. The alertness of someone waiting to see what their silence produces. Both require a response, but not the same response. For genuine withdrawal, presence, attention, the willingness to simply ask, without defensiveness, without an immediate need to fix, "I notice you seem somewhere else tonight. I'm here if you want to talk." That's it. No diagnosis, no performance, just an open door. For strategic silence, steadiness, not coldness, not retaliation. Steadiness. You don't perform anxiety for an audience. You don't chase what's being dangled. You stay grounded in yourself, warm but unhurried, and let her come back to the conversation when she's ready to have it honestly. This distinction matters because neither approach works universally. A man who has decided that all women's silence is a manipulation will miss genuine pain. A man who treats all silence as a wound he caused will surrender his own stability to someone else's mood. Neither is clarity, neither is strength. What sits between them is discernment. Assume for a moment that the silence is real, that it is a woman who has mattered to you, moving incrementally toward the interior of herself, and that this movement is a response, at least in part, to patterns she has observed in how you show up. What does a man of experience, of actual intelligence, actually do? Not what instinct suggests. Instinct, particularly for men who grew up in an era where emotional expression was considered weakness, suggests two options: ignore it and hope it resolves, or address it forcefully and expect the clarity that directness usually provides. Neither works here. Ignoring it is what got the table to that temperature in the first place. And forcing a direct confrontation, just tell me what's wrong, often produces the opposite of what's intended. It isn't an invitation, it's a demand with a question mark attached. It says, I want this resolved on my timeline so I can stop feeling this discomfort. Women, particularly women who have lived long enough to know the difference, can hear that underneath the words. The more effective response is quieter, less dramatic, almost anticlimactic if you're expecting some grand gesture to be the answer. It starts with genuine noticing, not performed noticing, not I've been thinking about you more, delivered like a line. Actual, specific, observable noticing, the kind that says, I see the details of your life, because I am paying attention to you, not just to the idea of you. You noticed she mentioned a particular friend was going through something difficult 3 weeks ago, and you ask how that friend is doing now. You notice that she has rearranged something in the living room, and you say what you actually think of it. You notice that she ordered the same thing she always orders at a restaurant you've been to together, and you remember what she ordered the first time you went years ago, and you mention it. Small things, specific things. The kind of things that cannot be faked because they require actual presence over time to accumulate. This is not a strategy in the manipulative sense. It is a correction of attention. And alongside that, less filling of space. Men who talk to fill silence, who treat quiet as a problem to be solved with words, are paradoxically the loneliest people in a conversation. She can feel the monologue. She knows when she is an audience and when she is a participant. After 60, she is less willing to be an audience. Letting silence breathe, not with awkwardness, but with ease, is one of the highest status things a man can do in a close relationship. It communicates something that words cannot. I am comfortable enough in myself and with you that I do not need to fill every moment with the sound of my own voice. There is also the question of asking, not to extract information, but to express genuine interest. An open question, asked without the undertone of urgency, is an act of respect. It says, your inner life is interesting to me. Not tell me what's wrong so we can get back to normal. Normal is what produced the silence. What she's looking for, and what frankly most men underestimate their capacity to provide, is the sense that she has not been reduced to a fixture. That she remains to you a person whose thoughts still have the power to surprise you. Surprise requires curiosity, and curiosity at this stage of life is a choice. There is a version of this conversation that stays practical. Here's what to notice, here's what to say, here's how to respond. But there is a deeper question underneath all of it, one that men in their 60s and 70s are, in many ways, uniquely positioned to answer. Who are you when you are not being needed? The generation of men now in their late 50s and 70s built their identity largely around function. Provider, fixer, decision maker, father, the man who handled things. And for decades, that function gave them legibility to themselves and to others. They knew where they stood because they knew what they did. But after 60, the functions begin to change shape. Children are grown, careers are winding, the body has an opinion about what it will and won't do. And the women who have been alongside these men, or who have come into their lives in this chapter, are not looking for the man who handles things. They have handled plenty themselves. They are looking for something less transactional and more rare. They are looking for the man who is present. Not present in the sense of physically in the room. Any chair accomplishes that. Present in the sense of actually inhabiting the moment, of not being half elsewhere, in his own thoughts, his own grievances, his own sense of how things should be going, of being able to sit across a dinner table and find in the person across from him something worth being curious about. That is not a small thing. For many men, it is the work of a decade, quietly undoing the habits of a lifetime that said, contain yourself, project confidence, stay on the surface, don't need anything. The irony is that the qualities that made men powerful in the functional years, control, decisiveness, forward momentum, can become the very things that create distance in the relational years, not because they are flaws, but because they are incomplete without their counterparts. Receptivity, stillness, the willingness to be affected by someone else without needing to immediately manage that effect. The man who sat at that dinner table, reaching for his wine, filling the silence with a weather report. He was not a bad man. He was a man still running the operating system of 40 years ago, in a moment that required something newer. And here is what no one tells men of his generation clearly enough. It is not too late to update. Not as a dramatic reinvention, not as a performance of sensitivity that feels foreign and hollow, but as a quiet expansion, the kind that happens when a man decides to pay attention to something he previously moved past. The kind that happens when he asks a question and actually listens to the answer without preparing his response while she's still speaking. The kind that happens when he notices a woman going quiet and instead of filling the air or dismissing the signal, sits still and asks himself, what is she no longer saying to me, and what has it cost her to stop? That question, honest, without defensiveness, without the immediate need to have an answer, is the beginning of something, not a solution, a beginning. The man who can sit with that question, who can let it work on him rather than rushing past it, is not a diminished man. He is not a man who has surrendered his authority or his composure. He is a man who has grown precise enough to know what actually matters. And what actually matters, in the years when the noise of the world begins to quiet and the question of what you leave behind starts to have more weight, what actually matters is whether the people you have loved felt that love as something real, something present, something that saw them. Legacy is not built in grand gestures. It is built in 10,000 ordinary moments of genuine attention. The woman across that table is waiting, not for a better man, for the fuller version of the one already sitting there. So the question worth carrying out of this conversation is not, what should I say when she goes quiet? The question is, what kind of presence have I been? And what kind do I still have time to become? Calm is not distance. Strength is not silence. Authority is not the absence of tenderness. The men who understand that don't need to be told. And the ones who are just now learning it, they are exactly on time.